Her heart was frozen, but he melted it without firing a shot. The Ice Empress, the bridge of the Nethys Ascendant, hummed with the cold efficiency that had made Empress Zephyra Keth the most feared ruler in 3 galactic quadrants. Ice crystals formed naturally along the bulkheads where her presence lingered, a side effect of her species' emotional regulation system. The Vorthak had evolved on a frozen world where feelings meant death, where survival demanded absolute control. Captain Jorik Voss of the human vessel Wandering Star stood in restraints before her throne, flanked by 2 towering Vorthak guards whose breath misted in the frigid air. His ship had been captured attempting to rescue colonists from Kepler 442b, another world marked for pacification by the Vorthak Empire. "You interest me, human," Zephyra spoke, her voice carrying the musical quality of wind through ice caves. Her skin held the pale blue luminescence of her kind, and her eyes were like captured starlight, beautiful and utterly cold. "Your species fights wars you cannot win for people you barely know." Jorik shifted slightly, testing his bonds. Unlike most prisoners brought before the Ice Empress, he didn't cower or plead. Instead, he studied her with the same curiosity she directed at him. "Maybe that's what makes us human," he said simply. "We care about things that don't make strategic sense." The temperature dropped another degree. Several bridge officers instinctively stepped back from their stations. Zephyra's emotional control was legendary. No Vorthak had seen her lose composure in over 2 centuries of rule. She had frozen entire star systems not from anger, but from the cold calculation that fear maintained order. "Explain this, caring," she commanded, leaning forward slightly. The motion caused her elaborate crown of living ice to shift, casting prismatic light across the bridge. Jorik considered his words carefully. He'd heard the stories. Prisoners who amused the Ice Empress lived longer, but only until her interest waned. It's hard to explain to someone who's never felt it. It's like warmth that spreads from inside, makes you want to protect things even when it hurts you. Warmth is weakness. It clouds judgment. Does it? Jorik met her gaze directly. "Your empire spans thousands of worlds, but how many of your subjects would die for you out of love rather than fear?" The question hung in the recycled air like a challenge. Zephyra had built her realm on the principle that love was chaos, that only cold logic could maintain order across the stars. Her own species had evolved beyond such primitive emotions, or so their philosophers claimed. "Love," she said the word like it tasted foreign, "is an inefficiency." "Maybe," Jorik agreed unexpectedly, "but it's also what makes life worth living instead of just surviving." For the first time in decades, Zephyra felt something stir beneath her careful emotional barriers. Not anger or contempt, though she understood. This was something else. Something that made her want to hear him speak again even as logic demanded his immediate execution. She stood abruptly, her flowing robes of woven ice crystals trailing behind her. The guards tensed, expecting an execution. Order. Instead, she circled Jorik slowly, studying him like a puzzle that refused to be solved. "You will be confined to quarters," she announced. "I require further study of your species' psychological anomalies." The bridge crew exchanged glances. The Ice Empress never kept prisoners for study. She kept them for interrogation, for public execution, for strategic advantage, but never from curiosity. As the guards led Jorik away, he looked back once. "Your Majesty," he called out, using the formal address for the first time. "Has anyone ever told you that your eyes aren't really cold? They're just waiting." The doors sealed behind him with a pneumatic hiss. Zephyra stood motionless for a long moment, one hand unconsciously touching her chest where something warm and unfamiliar had begun to kindle. Around her, the bridge temperature rose by precisely 1 degree, unnoticed by her instruments, but felt by every soul aboard the ship. Change had begun with a single question about love, asked by a human who saw warmth in eyes that had frozen worlds. Part 2. Unexpected Conversations. Jorik's quarters aboard the Nethys Ascendant were a study in Vorthak efficiency, sparse, cold, and designed to remind occupants of their captivity. The walls were smooth metal that collected condensation from his breath, and the single viewport showed only the endless star field. Yet somehow it was the most comfortable prison cell he'd ever occupied. The door chimed, not the harsh buzz of an alarm but an actual musical tone. Zephyra entered alone, which itself was unprecedented. Ice Empresses did not visit prisoners without guards, without ceremony, without the elaborate protocols that reinforced their divine authority. "You're full of surprises," Jorik observed, not bothering to stand. He sat cross-legged on the narrow bunk, a posture that somehow managed to convey respect without subservience. "I have questions about human behavior patterns," Zephyra announced, though she made no move to sit in the single chair provided. Instead, she remained standing, hands clasped behind her back in a pose that radiated controlled tension. "Ask away, though I should warn you, I'm not exactly your typical human specimen." "Define typical." Jorik laughed, a warm sound that seemed to echo strangely in the cold room. "Most humans don't volunteer for suicide missions to rescue strangers. Most humans don't chat casually with galactic tyrants either. I am not a tyrant, I am an empress. What's the difference?" The question should have earned him instant execution. Instead, Zephyra found herself actually considering it. An empress rules by divine right and natural superiority. A tyrant rules through fear alone. And which do you think your subjects see you as? Another question that challenged everything she'd built her identity upon. Zephyra moved to the viewport, her reflection ghostly in the reinforced crystal. "My subjects see order, peace, prosperity under law." "Built on how many frozen corpses?" "The necessary amount." But the answer came more slowly than usual, as if she had to think about it. Jorik studied her profile against the stars. "You know what I find interesting? You could have had me executed a dozen times by now, but you keep coming. Back to talk." "Why?" Zephyra turned from the viewport, her luminescent eyes narrowing. "You are an anomaly. Your species' behavioral patterns do not match any logical framework. It requires investigation. Or maybe you're just lonely." The temperature in the room plummeted 10 degrees in an instant. Frost began forming on every surface as Zephyra's emotional barriers flared. "I am Empress of 47 star systems. I do not experience loneliness." "Everyone experiences loneliness," Jorik said gently, his breath misting in the suddenly arctic air. "Even Ice Empresses, especially Ice Empresses, I'd guess. How long since you've had a conversation where someone wasn't afraid of you?" The frost stopped spreading, though the temperature remained bitter. Zephyra stood perfectly still, and for a moment, Jorik glimpsed something in her expression. Not vulnerability exactly, but a crack in the perfect ice sculpture of her composure. "Fear ensures honesty," she said finally. "Does it? Or does it just ensure people tell you what they think you want to hear?" Zephyra had no immediate answer. In her centuries of rule, she had grown accustomed to absolute agreement, to the trembling deference of subjects who dared not contradict her smallest whim. But when had she last heard an original thought? When had anyone challenged her to think beyond the rigid frameworks of Vorthak philosophy? "Your species is chaos incarnate," she said, though it sounded more like curiosity than condemnation. "Probably. But chaos isn't always bad. Sometimes it's what happens when something rigid finally starts to bend instead of break." She moved closer, studying his face with the intensity of a scientist examining a new form of life. "You do not fear me." "I'm terrified of you," Jorik corrected. "But I'm also fascinated by you. That's another human thing. We're attracted to contradictions." "What contradictions?" "An empress who rules through fear but visits prisoners alone. A conqueror who could destroy my ship with a thought but instead asks questions about emotions. A woman who's convinced herself she's above feeling anything, while radiating loneliness like heat from a star." The room fell silent except for the subtle hum of life support systems working to maintain breathable atmosphere. Zephyra stood close enough now that Jorik could see the intricate patterns of bioluminescence that played beneath her skin. Not cold light, he realized, but something that pulsed in rhythm with whatever passed for a Vorthak heartbeat. "I should execute you for presumption," she said quietly. Probably, he agreed. But you won't. Why? Because then you'd be alone again. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow. For the first time in centuries, Zephyra Keth, Ice Empress of the Vorthak, sat down. Cracks in the ice, the transformation began subtly. Senior Bridge Officer Talix noticed it first when the Empress issued her daily orders without a single execution decree. Navigation Chief Mykos observed that their route through the Helix Nebula had been adjusted to avoid 3 inhabited systems that were previously marked for conquest. But it was Medical Officer Vin who reported the most disturbing anomaly. The ship's ambient temperature had risen by 0.3 degrees over the past week. In the Vorthak Empire, such changes were not merely noticed. They were investigated with the thoroughness of a military tribunal. The human is having an unprecedented psychological effect on Her Imperial Majesty, Chief Intelligence Officer Krex reported to the assembled senior staff. His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that could be construed as treason. I recommend immediate disposal of the prisoner and memory adjustment protocols for the Empress. The suggestion hung in the recycled air of the conference room like a death sentence. No one had ever suggested that the Ice Empress required adjustment. The very concept was tantamount to mutiny. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Their perfect, untouchable ruler was changing. Meanwhile, 3 decks below, Jorik had discovered something remarkable about Vorthak architecture. The environmental controls in his quarters were more sophisticated than anything humanity had developed, capable of micro-adjustments that could regulate not just temperature and humidity, but even the emotional resonance frequencies that affected mood in species across the galaxy. You've been experimenting, Zephyra observed as she entered his quarters for what had become a daily ritual. Today she wore simpler robes, still elegant but lacking the intimidating grandeur of full imperial regalia. Just curious about how things work, Jorik replied, not looking up from the environmental panel he'd somehow managed to access. Did you know your ship's systems can generate acoustic frequencies that promote different emotional states? That's incredible technology. It is necessary technology. Emotions are contagious. They must be controlled aboard vessels containing multiple species. Or they could be encouraged. Look at this setting. Jorik manipulated the controls, and suddenly the room filled with a barely perceptible harmonic that seemed to make the air itself feel warmer, more welcoming. Your people didn't just learn to suppress emotions, you learned to enhance them when needed. Zephyra felt the change immediately, a loosening in her chest that she had trained herself to resist for centuries, but instead of fighting it, she found herself sitting down across from him, drawn by curiosity. The ancient Vorthak were not always as we are now, she admitted, surprising herself with the confession. Before the Great Cooling, our people were different? What was the Great Cooling? A philosophical revolution that occurred when our world began to freeze. Our ancestors believed that emotion had made them weak, vulnerable to the environmental changes that nearly destroyed our species. So they chose to evolve beyond feeling. But you didn't really evolve beyond it, Jorik said gently. You just built really sophisticated ways to suppress it. Zephyra was quiet for a long moment, her luminescent skin patterns shifting in ways Jorik was beginning to recognize as signs of internal conflict. Perhaps? What were your people like before they decided feelings were the enemy? It was a question no Vorthak had asked in over a millennium. The pre-cooling era was considered primitive, shameful, a time of chaos that nearly led to extinction. But as Zephyra sat in the subtly warm air of Jorik's modified quarters, she found herself remembering stories her grandmother had told her. In secret, tales of Vorthak who sang to the aurora lights and carved poetry into ice that would melt with the changing seasons. They created art, she said slowly. Music that wasn't just mathematical precision, but something that stirred the soul. They fell in love, not the calculated partnerships we arrange now, but passionate, irrational bonds that sometimes lasted centuries. That sounds beautiful. It was chaotic, inefficient. It led to wars over perceived slights, to resources wasted on aesthetic pursuits, to leaders who made decisions based on personal attachment rather than logical analysis. It led to a species that was alive instead of just surviving. The words hit her with unexpected force. Zephyra realized that she could not remember the last time she had felt truly alive, not just functioning, not just existing in her role as Empress, but genuinely experiencing the moment she was in. "The Council grows concerned about my recent decisions," she confessed. "What kind of decisions?" "I postponed the sterilization of 3 worlds. I granted asylum to a group of refugees, rather than processing them for labor conscription. I have not ordered an execution in 18 days, Jorik smiled. "Sounds terrible. How will the galaxy survive such mercy? You mock the foundations of order itself." "I celebrate the emergence of compassion. There's a difference." Zephyra stood and moved to the viewport, watching the stars wheel slowly past. "My people would see this conversation as evidence of contamination, of weakness that threatens the stability of the Empire. Your people might surprise you. Maybe they're as tired of being cold as you are." She turned to look at him, this impossible human who had somehow made her question everything she had built her life upon. "What if you are wrong? What if compassion truly is the path to chaos and destruction? Then at least you'll have lived before you died," Jorik replied. Instead of just existing in a beautiful, perfect, frozen hell, the environmental systems hummed quietly around them, maintaining the delicate balance between warmth and cold, between order and the growing possibility of something beautifully unpredictable. Part 4. The warmth spreads. The rebellion began in the ship's botanical gardens, a sterile facility designed for food production efficiency, where specially bred crops grew in perfect rows under artificial suns. Botanist third-class Lyra had been tending the hydroponic systems when she noticed something extraordinary. One of the food processors had been singing. Not the mechanical humming of machinery, but actual music, improvised melodies that seemed to flow from some deeper wellspring of creativity. When confronted, the worker, a young Vorthak named Kale, had simply said, "It makes the plants grow better," and impossibly, he was right. The yields in his section were up 12%. The Yao discovery might have remained a minor anomaly, logged and forgotten, except that Lyra found herself humming the same melodies while she worked. Soon, other workers in nearby sections began unconsciously matching the rhythm. Within days, productivity across the entire botanical section had increased, but more disturbing to the ship's administrators was the change in behavior. Workers were staying later, not from duty but from what appeared to be enjoyment. Chief Medical Officer Vin documented the phenomenon with clinical precision. Heart rates were up, but stress hormones were down. Brain scans showed increased activity in neural pathways associated with creativity and social bonding, areas that had been deliberately suppressed in Vorthak society for centuries. "It's spreading," Intelligence Officer Krex reported to the emergency session of senior staff. "Whatever psychological contagion the human has introduced, it's affecting crew performance across 7 decks. "Define affecting," demanded Chief Engineer Thorak. "Engineering efficiency is up 9%, but the teams are engaging in unauthorized modifications to systems, aesthetic improvements that serve no functional purpose. Recreation periods are being extended voluntarily. There have been 17 instances of crew members creating what can only be described as art from spare materials." The senior staff exchanged glances heavy with unspoken implications. Art was not forbidden in Vorthak society. It simply didn't occur to properly conditioned minds. The emergence of creative impulses suggested a fundamental breakdown in the psychological frameworks that maintained their civilization. Meanwhile, in his quarters, Jorik was teaching Zephyra to play chess using pieces he'd carved from food containers. The game itself was simple enough for her strategic mind to master quickly, but she found herself fascinated by the conversations that flowed around the moves. Stories of Earth, discussions of philosophy, shared memories that seemed to warm the space between them more effectively than any environmental control. "Your move," Jorik said, studying the board with mock seriousness. Zephyra advanced her queen, a piece she'd initially found offensive. the concept of a powerful female ruler being used as a mere game token. But Jorik had explained that the queen was actually the strongest piece on the board, capable of moving in any direction with unlimited range. Like you, he'd said, and somehow the comparison had felt like the greatest compliment she'd ever received. Check, she announced, then added with the faintest hint of smugness. Mate in 3 moves. You're getting good at this, Jorik acknowledged, tipping his king over in surrender. But you're playing to win. That's not always the point. What else would be the point of playing? Sometimes the point is just playing. The conversation. The time spent together. The pleasure of watching someone else think. It was such a fundamentally alien concept that Zephyra found herself staring at him in genuine confusion. In her world, every action served a purpose, advanced, a goal, contributed to the greater efficiency of the whole. The idea of doing something simply for the joy of doing it was revolutionary. Your species is truly insane, she said, but there was warmth in her voice rather than condemnation. Probably, but we're happy about it. The door chimed, not the musical tone that had become their signal, but the harsh military alert that meant official business. Zephyra's posture straightened automatically as Chief Intelligence Officer Krex entered, flanked by 2 guards. Your Imperial Majesty, Krex began, his voice carrying the careful formality of someone delivering unwelcome news. The Senior Council requests your immediate presence. There are concerns about the prisoner's continued influence on ship operations. Zephyra felt something cold settle in her chest. Not the familiar coldness of emotional suppression, but the chill of fear. Fear for Jorik, whose crime was showing her that life could be more than mere existence. Fear for herself and what she was becoming. Fear for her people, who were beginning to remember what they had chosen to forget. Of course, she said, rising with fluid grace. I will attend the council immediately. As she moved toward the door, Jorik's voice stopped her. Zephyra. He'd never used her name before, had always maintained the formal addresses of prisoner to captor. Now he spoke it like something precious. Whatever they want you to decide, remember that you have choices. You've always had choices. She looked back at him, this impossible human who had somehow made her believe that an ice empress could learn to feel warmth without losing herself entirely. The chess pieces sat scattered between them, a game unfinished but not abandoned. I know, she said softly. Then, louder, for the benefit of the guards. Maintain standard security protocols. The prisoner remains under my personal protection. It was the first time she had ever described a captive as being under her protection rather than her control. As she left, the environmental systems registered another degree of warming, not from the ship's heating systems, but from the growing fire in her heart that no amount of ancient conditioning could fully extinguish. The Senior Council was waiting, and with them, the choice between the cold certainty of her past and the warm uncertainty of a future she was only beginning to imagine. Hearts ablaze. The Senior Council chamber aboard the Nethys Ascendant had been designed to inspire awe and enforce hierarchy. Carved from a single block of crystallized ice harvested from the Vorthak homeworld, it had witnessed 1,000 years of imperial decisions that shaped the fate of worlds. The temperature was kept at precisely the level that promoted clear thinking, while suppressing emotional responses, a setting that had never failed to work until today. Zephyra entered to find her 5 most senior advisors arranged in their traditional formation: Intelligence Officer Krex, Chief Engineer Thorak, Medical Officer Vin, Fleet Coordinator Milex, and Grand Strategist Zara. Each represented centuries of loyal service, minds honed to perfect efficiency in service of the Empire. Your Imperial Majesty, Krex began without preamble. We have documented 17 separate incidents of behavioral deviation across the ship's crew. Productivity metrics show concerning patterns that correlate directly with the human prisoner's presence aboard this vessel. Define concerning, Zephyra said, though she already knew the answer. Medical Officer Vin consulted his data pad. Crew, Members are exhibiting increased levels of dopamine, oxytocin, and other neurochemicals associated with pleasure and social bonding. More disturbing, brain scans show activity in regions we believe to be dormant, areas connected to creativity, empathy, and what ancient texts called joy. These chemicals are not inherently harmful, Zephyra observed. They are destabilizing, Grand Strategist Zara interjected. Already we have reports of crew members questioning orders, not from insubordination but from what they term moral concerns. The efficiency that has maintained our empire for a millennium is being compromised by primitive emotional responses. Zephyra felt the familiar coldness settling around her heart, the trained response of her people to emotional challenges. But beneath it, something else burned. A warmth that had nothing to do with environmental controls and everything to do with the memory of shared laughter, of conversations that served no strategic purpose, of feeling truly alive for the first time in centuries. "What do you recommend?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Immediate termination of the human prisoner," Krex said without hesitation. "Memory adjustment protocols for affected crew members, a return to proper operational parameters. And if I refuse?" The silence that followed was deafening. In the history of the Vorthak Empire, an empress had never refused the unanimous recommendation of her senior council. The very question challenged the foundations of their society. "Your Majesty," Fleet Coordinator Milek said carefully, "the council exists to preserve the empire's stability. If personal attachments were to compromise your judgment, you would remove me," Zephyra finished. It wasn't a question. "We would preserve the empire," Zara said firmly, "as you have taught us to do." The moment crystallized around her like the ice that formed in her presence. Zephyra realized she faced a choice that would define not just her own future, but the future of every being under her rule. She could return to the cold certainty of perfect order, execute the human who had shown her warmth and continue ruling through fear and efficiency, or she could choose something unprecedented in Vorthak history. She could choose to feel. "Bring him here," she commanded. "Your Majesty, that is inadvisable. I said bring him here." The authority in her voice brooked no argument. Within minutes, Yorick was escorted into the chamber, his hands bound but his expression calm. He took in the assembled council with the same curious attention he gave everything else, as if even his own trial was just another fascinating puzzle to solve. "So," he said conversationally, "I'm guessing this isn't about my chess-playing technique." Despite everything, Zephyra felt her lips twitch towards something that might have been a smile. Even facing execution, he remained impossibly, infuriatingly human. "The council believes you represent a threat to the stability of the empire," she said formally. "Do I?" It was the question that cut to the heart of everything. Did change mean destruction? Did feeling mean weakness? Did choosing warmth over cold mean abandoning everything that had made the Vorthak strong? "You represent choice," Zephyra said slowly, the realization forming as she spoke. "The choice to feel, the choice to create rather than simply consume, the choice to value individual happiness alongside collective efficiency. And is that a threat?" Zephyra looked around the chamber at her advisors, beings who had served her faithfully for centuries, who had helped her build an empire that spanned the galaxy. They were efficient, loyal, and utterly predictable. They were also, she realized with startling clarity, deeply unhappy. "No," she said finally. "It's evolution." The temperature in the chamber began to rise, not from the environmental systems, but from something far more fundamental, the warmth of a heart that had been frozen for too long finally beginning to thaw. "I hereby decree the dissolution of the pacification protocol," Zephyra announced, her voice carrying the full authority of her position. "All scheduled planetary destructions are cancelled. Refugee populations will be offered sanctuary rather than conscription. And the prisoner," she paused, meeting Jorik's eyes. "The prisoner will be offered a position as cultural exchange advisor, should he choose to accept." The council erupted in protests, but Zephyra was no longer listening. She was watching Jorik's face light up with something she was learning to recognize as joy, pure, uncomplicated happiness that had nothing to do with strategic advantage and everything to do with the simple fact that life, somewhere in the galaxy, would be better. "I accept," he said simply. Later, as the council debated emergency protocols and the crew whispered of changes that seemed too good to be true, Zephyra stood once again at the viewport in what had been Jorik's quarters. But this time she wasn't alone. "So," Jorik said, joining her at the window, "what happens to an Ice Empress when she learns to feel?" Zephyra considered the question seriously. Around them the ship hummed with new energy, as crew members began to rediscover parts of themselves they had forgotten existed. She could feel the change in the air itself, warmer, more alive, touched with possibilities that efficiency alone could never achieve. "I suppose," she said finally, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to colors that had no names in the cold vocabulary of her people. "She becomes something else entirely. Something better." Outside the viewport, the stars seemed brighter somehow, as if the universe itself approved of Heart's learning to beat with warmth instead of cold precision. And in the distance, barely visible against the cosmic backdrop, the first of many worlds that would be saved rather than conquered, spun peacefully, in the light of their ancient suns. The Ice Empress was gone. In her place stood something unprecedented. A ruler who had learned that the greatest strength was not the power to destroy, but the courage to create, to feel, and to love. The revolution had begun with a single human's refusal to be afraid. It would spread across the stars like wildfire, melting hearts that had been frozen for far too long.